Hello, one and all. My name is Jordan Leroy Hansen, also known as Ledev, and welcome to Top Deck Thoughts for Ikoria Review Day, technically 2.5 and free. I'm trying to cover up all these right now and such, get my quick thoughts on them, because I realize about 100 cards are going to be spoiled tomorrow, so I was originally going to just pile this up, but I figured that would be like a 2-hour video, so I'm going to try to do a lightning round on these, because some of these are good, some of these are just kind of like really good draft cards, but nevertheless, let's actually get onto it. Skycat Sovereign. White and a blue, a 1/1 flyer, but it gets +1/+1 for each other creature you control with flying, and it has an activated ability of 2 white and a blue, create a 1/1 white cat bird creature token with flying. Overall, cute card. Definitely funny for kind of like cat tribal or like pretty much the obvious Azorius Flyers deck that you always see running around on Arena and such. Whether or not the card's good, it's kind of one of those cards where I think it's mostly going to be a good limited card, especially if you get some pretty good mutate cards to actually mutate on this to make it have a significantly bigger body. Because the problem is, unless you're specifically in the Flyers deck, this is going to stay a 1/1 most of the time, maybe a 2/2 or free, and we have at least seen enough removal in the format that can easily take this down. We're actually going to talk about a few removals that can take this bird down pretty quick. So, overall, in limited, I think it's good, but I wouldn't like pack one, pick one it per se, but it's good. In standard, probably not. I mean, the Azorius Flyers are definitely going to try it out because it gets bigger with more flyers they have. They usually turn one the little, pretty much Life Hawk, and then turn two this, then it's just a 2/2, which totally fine, and then they play the third flyer and it becomes a free. It can increment big, but it's really going to specifically go into that deck. Maybe some mutation variation, but we're going to have to wait and see. But honestly, this card is cool, but I don't think it's amazing, in my personal opinion on that one. Okay, I'm going to have the window down so I can make sure I back out of these. Anyway, next up, Flame Spill, which, hey, speaking of a removal that can take it out pretty easily. Let's see, why is it not zoomed in? Okay, it's getting a little log, but we can actually see it through here, so probably a little lag. There we go. Technical difficulties, everybody. Anyway, we can probably see it right now. Flame Spill, 2 and a red for an instant. Flame Spill deals 4 damage to target creature. Excess damage is dealt to the creature's control instead. Overall, a nice limited burn spell. It's definitely going to take out the Skycat Sovereign without a sweat, pretty much. But also, it's just pretty decent early game removal to mid-range removal. You want to make sure you take out a specific creature with it. And even if you take out like a token or a bear with it, there we go. Now it's going. If you take a bear out with it, the fact that you can deal excess damage to the opponent is actually very nice. So, we played with Super Death Ray if you ever played an Unstable. That card was actually a pretty decent removal spell in draft, so I think this is going to have the same thing. Standard, I mean, there's some cute shenanigans you could do with this with Torben, and the fact that this can help you both be a removal spell that can help enable Spectacle, which is still a mechanic in Standard, is something to be at least very considerate about, at the very least. But there is better removal in the format, so, maybe. One card that actually might see some play in some red decks and also just other variation decks, Fire Prophecy, 1 of a red instant, it deals 3 damage to target creature. So, what's the basic premise of this? Is it like a Worst Lightning Bolt? Well, you may put a card from your hand onto the bottom of your library. If you do, draw a card. Overall, interesting removal. It's definitely could be considered for combo-based decks and such, because it's both a removal spell as well that works as a card to help dig deeper into your deck, into your combo pieces and such. That's why I think it's going to see its primary play. Nevertheless, definitely good limited card. No sweat about that. It's removal. That also helps you dig deep into your deck, which is a 40-card deck, so it helps you get to your mid-range to even late game strategies. So, I would say perfect for limited. I think it will see some experimentation standard because, well, the ability to dig into your deck is nothing to underestimate. Next up, Necropanther. 1 white and a black for a 3/3 cat nightmare that has mutate for 2 in Orzhov hybrid mana. Whenever this creature mutates, return target creature card with converted mana 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. I like this card a lot. The factor is just a 3 mana free is perfectly fine stats, But the factor is that 4 mana, you can just mutate this on something and then get this effect, which is essentially return a creature card with converted mana cost 3 or less. You could return this from the battle if it was in the graveyard to the battlefield, or even just your early game. I could see this in shenanigans, like for people who play like in white-black, they play Alcids of Life Protection or something, you know, the one that you sacrifice and give indestructible. The fact that you can use Necropanther's mutate ability to return that back, maybe on turn 5, to have essentially that Alcid back on the battlefield to help protect its mutated form. Definitely something to very consider of standard. Limited, it's just a really good card. It helps you bring back early game threats to just pretty much help with board stalls and such. So, I like the card a lot. Has a chance for standard play, I would say. Next up, this one is their interpretation of its Great Minds. 2 and a blue for sorcery. This spell will cost 2 less to cast if you control a human and a non-human creature. Draw 2 cards. So essentially, it's divination, but it's divination that can cost 1 mana if you have a deck design that both has human and non-human creatures. I can see blue-white having a possibility of doing this and such, and maybe other colors. 1 mana to draw 2 cards is nothing to underestimate, but you do have to have the right deck to do it. Like, the one deck that I think can actually take advantage of this card is probably the red-blue draw 2 is a deck that we've seen in Eldraine, since they usually play stuff like Improbable Alliance, but they also play Ironcrag Pyromancer, which is both a human and the fairies are non-human, so this could actually just be a very advantageous spell to actually play in that deck. It's still sorcery speed, but sorcery speed drawing 2 cards is very beneficial. It gets into your deck faster if you need to draw into something. So, it has a chance. It's definitely a good limited card, especially if you can meet the conditions of the Manhood Dungeon. And even if you don't, 3 mana drawing 2 cards in limited is perfectly fine. Next up, Almighty Bush Rag. Still silliest little goofball ever. Anyway, it's a 1 mana 1/1 trample, but it also has free and a green. Almighty Bush Rag gets +3/+3 until end of turn. You're probably not playing this in standard, but in limited, I do think it has a teeny little bit of chance since mutate is a thing. This could just be played on turn 1. If it gets removed, big deal. But if it doesn't, then you can actually just mutate it into a bigger creature and that has this activated ability. Which that activated ability on, say, let's say, for example, on one of the Apexes or even one of the mid-range creatures that you see in the format that are mutate, like Freeze, maybe even a 4/4, just having that activated ability to make it like a 7/7 or even a 5/5 with trample is actually pretty legit. So, I would say, actually a decent limited card. Like, it's not pack one, pick one, but if you're in green, you have mutate shenanigans, I would say give it a pickup. But if they're better cards, obviously play the better cards. Next up, Offspring's Revenge. A 5 mana Mardu enchantment that has the ability that at the beginning of combat on your turn, exile target red, white, or black creature card from your graveyard. Create a token that's a copy of that card, except it's a 1/1. It gains haste until your next turn. Honestly, for standard, this is where it's going to have a lot of its potential. There's a lot of people that have been contemplating like ETP shenanigans with this card and such, kind of like with stuff like Grey Merchant of Asphodel, or even just a lot of the good Mardu colored cards, or just essentially within that color pair that have really powerful ETPs, or even just practical activated abilities, such as, for example, even just exiling an Alcid, as I mentioned before, could just be perfectly fine. Get a quick 1/1 haste that you can use to sack to give one of your fiends indestructible and such, so, or not indestructible, but hexproof from specific colors, or protection, you know what I mean. But there is also the fact that I think this actually has a potential to make Mardu aggro potentially a thing, because the factor is this is not a horrible top into a deck that is a aggro-based Mardu deck, especially since we have stuff like Anats in the format. Being able to reanimate an Anats from the graveyard and just be able to be like a, let's say this is the only permanent on the battlefield, so it's 2 cost permanent, so then it would be a hasty free one that if it dies, it gets you still a satire token. That's actually legit. Plus, there's also shenanigans you can do with this, such as like a reanimator-based deck strategy design, where you actually reanimate like 1/1s that have really powerful abilities or even powerful like attack triggers, like Dracusef is the one I could think of right off the bat. I could even see some shenanigans with Billis, Blood. So, honestly, I think this card has some potential. It's definitely going to be a fun Brooming Around card, but I do think its primary advantage is going to be if the Mardu aggro deck exists. then they're probably going to try this out at the very least. Maybe Mardu Control might try it if they have like powerful control-based creatures that reanimated it from the graveyard. Is nothing to sneeze at. We have to wait and see. Still, like the card, and the flavor text is legit, like, both sad and satisfying at the same time. I'll put it like that. Next up, the Boros companion of the pretty much companion cycle. Brain fart. Serta the Dawnmaker. 1 Boros hybrid mana. For a legendary creature elemental fox. Companion. So pretty much as we mentioned before, companion is you have to meet these conditions if you want to have it in your sideboard and cast it from the sideboard. What's the condition? Well, each permanent card in your starting deck has an activated ability. If this card is your chosen companion, you may cast it once from outside the game, aka your sideboard. But then what does it do? Well, abilities you activate that aren't mana abilities cost 2 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1 mana. And it also has an activated ability of 1. Target creature can't block this turn. This is a really cool card. I'm not gonna lie. This is a card where many people have been already speculating this in Commander with some very broken shenanigans, like with Basalt Monolith and stuff like that. But mostly, I'm going to stick with Standard on here. I do think there's some potential in Standard for this card. Mostly because for a few things. One, as many people were kind of tilting their heads, it's like, are there really cards with good activated abilities? Yes, they're called cycle cards. This is actually a card to help actually discount your cycle cards in your deck design if you want them to. Like, you can probably early game cycle for cheap and such, but if you want a discounted cycle, this card does that pretty easily. Plus, also, if you want to do like an Equipment Matters type deck design, this actually works perfectly because then the equip cost gets lowered because it is considered an activated ability. Maybe even in a Super Friends type deck design, you could even consider playing this card. Sure, it's not going to get the mana reduction because activated Loyalty Planeswalker abilities are not affected by this, but if you have things like, I don't know, maybe if you play this like, say, in the main in a Fires of Vengeance list, the fact that you can use this to discount Cavalier of Flames and such is nothing to sneeze at. There's definitely a lot of practical applications when you actually look at permanents that you have that have activated abilities. Plus, another one that I think people are kind of miscounting on if you don't use that as your companion and put it in your main, this does actually discount your castle cycle of lands, which could be pretty significant. Like, for example, let's say we play this in a Mardu deck design, being able to discount Castle Lockflame to just be 2 black mana to draw a card and such, very significant. Or even just the Castle Embereth and such. Like, look at the whole castle cycle and just imagine, hey, that activated ability on that land is going to cost 2 less mana. Or even stuff like Blast Zone or such. So, keep in mind, this deduction is also on lands that have special abilities, so you gotta really keep that in mind, especially with stuff like Mobile District. Like, I can go on. I think this is going to where we see its primarily use, actually. I think most people are going to look at the lands in Standard and be like, hey, this discount my land-activated abilities. Cool! But also, it'll be very fascinating to see how the deck designs go with this. I'm definitely going to board around this card. That's probably going to be one of my second to third brew designs I'm going to do. Like, I kind of want to make a Jeskai... I'm forgetting the name of the Equipment Lord from Pharaohs Beyond Death. Someone will tell me in the comments, but essentially I want to do a variation of a Jeskai brew, playing with this to make my equipment cost less to activate and such, as well as with the... Oh, what's his name? It's like, starts with Delicados. Delicados. Play kind of like a Delicados-based design with this, so I'm really excited. Speaking of Cycle Matters, we have... Technically, they translated to the Tron Guard. It's 1 and a white for a human cleric. Whenever you cycle another card, you gain 1 life, cycling for 1 mana. Honestly, pretty decent common. It is definitely one of those that if you do have a cycle deck design, this is actually legitimately decent 2-drop. I could even see this in kind of like life gain decks that do have a Cycle Matters sub-strategy. Because the factor is, if you have stuff like Hiliad in the meta and such, and you just want to find implements of trying to gain 1 life, the factor that you can cycle like a later game spell early to just get that little lifelink, which then triggers off the Hiliad, is very significant. So yeah, I do think this actually has some chance to see some standard play, especially if a Boros light game style cycle deck exists. There's definitely payoffs for that, which we're going to get to the payoffs pretty soon, but overall, I actually like this card a lot. And even if you don't need the bear, you could just cycle it for a better, hopefully inferior later game card. So, yeah, I like this card a lot. Next up, the card that I'm both very excited and dreading at the same time, Ruinous Ultimatum. So the Ultimatum cycle is back, which essentially they're doing the Ultimatum cycle of all the con color wedges, essentially. So this one is Mardu. Mardu's my favorite color, so what do? Well, for 7 mana, red, red, white, 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 black, black, you have a sorcery spell that's destroy all non-land permanents your opponents control. I have two feelings about this card. One, I absolutely love it because I've been trying so hard to try to make Mardu Control work, and the fact that Mardu Control now has access to this one-sided board wipe that wipes everything that the opponents control, it's very powerful, especially if you install enough 2/7 mana and cast a spell. Because the chances are your opponent's going to have a hard time building up, so you can actually rebuild your stuff, especially since Mardu controls more of a mid-range deck, so they're going to take a lot of advantage of this card. So why am I dreading this card? Well, another deck that's going to probably take very good advantage of this is pretty much any of the Fire of Invention decks that we've seen. We've seen how the majority of Fire of Invention-based decks have been able to use cards that are out of their color pie, such as how even Jeskai Fires is able to play like stuff like Casualties of War and such. And I feel like either a Teamer variation of the deck or even Jeskai Fires might just put a 1 or 2 of in there and just be like, okay, have my Fires out, gonna cast my Fae, going Fae Wishes specifically, gonna get this Ultimatum, I win? Well, not I win, but you pretty much are, you get yourself into a significant board state that you probably win. So that is my primary concern with the card. But overall, I love this card. I definitely have Marchesa as a potential commander, and just having this as a board wipe in the deck is delicious. Next up, we go to Farfinder. Cute little fox. I always love these cute little foxes, like when they do fox designs on Magic. But anyway, what does it do? Well, it's a 1/1 with Vigilance. Decent. But it also has an ability that when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle your library. Overall, just a perfectly fine card. I always like these cards in limited, but also sometimes in constructed for more jankier brews that are very heavy in a variety of colors. Just being able to search for a basic to help you with your later game turns and such is perfectly nice. Funny synergy with stuff like with Yarok in standard and such, being able to search for 2 basic lands. And there's just also the factor that you can just use this pretty much in any Brawl deck as a way just to search for a specific land you need that is of the basic variety. I like this card a lot. I do think you'll see a lot of Brawl play at the very least. Maybe some standard play, and maybe some budget commander play. It's a cute card. Next up, we actually seen the final Planeswalker, and we've seen the alternate art with this one, which the alternate art is awesome sauce. It is Narset of the Ancient Way, 1 in Jeskai colors for a legendary Planeswalker Narset. For loyalty, it has +1, you gain 2 life, add either of the Jeskai colors from the mana pool, spend this mana only to cast a non-creature spell, so either blue, red, or white. Then -2, draw a card, then you discard a card. When you discard a non-land card this way, Narset of the Ancient Way deals damage equal to the card's converted mana cost to target creature or planeswalker. And then it has an ultimate, which the ultimate is probably the main weakness, and I say weakness in quotation marks here. -6. You get an emblem with whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this emblem deals 2 damage to any target. This card's good. This card is really good. And I think the one thing that comes right off the bat is most people are just saying this in Jeskai Fires, and yeah, that's perfectly fine. In Jeskai Fires, this is going to be legit awesome. Just the factor is that you can get incremental life gain and get little incremental mana, which can help you with like cheap spells like maybe a shock or maybe even just a temporary like beneficial 1 mana cost spell. Very beneficial, or maybe even later game just using it to get a little bit of additional mana put into a later spell. Most decks will probably try to this in the Fires of Invention, which then the +1 kind of you're probably only going to do it for the life gain part, but still perfectly fine and actually really good. -2, though, is legit where it gets pretty awesome. -2, the factor that you draw a card, but then it protects itself by just discarding any card that you probably don't need at the moment, and being able to deal anywhere between from 1 damage to, say, seeing that the ultimatum's out costing 7, you could deal 1 to 7 damage to a target creature or planeswalker. Very powerful. So, yeah, I do like the -2 a lot. And the -6, a lot of people are looking at this ultimate and are just like, it's alright. It's not like I win the game, which, honestly, I'm actually grateful that the ultimate is not I win the game. We actually have to see more of these planeswalker designs, because trust me, the ones that say I win the game are never fun to play against, let's just be frank. Plus, there is actually a really, really cheeky thing you can do with this card. Now, there is some planeswalkers that... There's just like with Jeskai Fires, you can just essentially play this with... Oh, there was... I can't remember. What was the starting loyalty for Nicol Bolas? Dragon God? I need to remember, because I think this is where it's actually going to... We have actually seen some people playing kind of like 4-color variations of this deck design, where they put red, white, blue, and black just because they can splash the black because due to Interplanar Beacon and such. So the fact that you can also just use this to essentially do just only -2 if Narset's on the battlefield, then that's actually pretty powerful, because then it's not -3, it's not at 1 loyalty, and then you get removed faster than, say, Timbuktu on a Bayou, essentially. So I do feel like there is a slight potential in the 4-color Planeswalker control decks that we have been seeing that Narset will actually see play, and obviously if you can get this 6 loyalty, or even 7 loyalty, then you just -6 with Nicol Bolas and still keep your Narset alive for either the -2/+1, so just little synergies like that. So overall, I do think the card is actually pretty good. I think it will see some standard play. It just has a lot of versatility, and plus, the most awesome part about this, it is a Jeskai Planeswalker, which means for people who play Brawl, they finally can have a Jeskai Walker as their quote-unquote brawler if they want to, which I've seen a lot of people on Twitter actually very happy about that. So it'll be fun to see how this evolves in the meta. Next up, speaking of ultimatums again, we now got to the Sultai Ultimatum, which is the Emergent Ultimatum. It has search your library for up to 3 mono-colored cards with different names and exile them. An opponent chooses one of those cards, shuffle that card into your library. You may cast the other card without the other cards, so that's plural, without paying their mana cost, and then you exile the spell. So, obviously a ridiculously powerful ultimatum in the right decks. Like, the factor is, mostly this is probably going to see its main gameplay in stuff like Commander, let's just be frank, because there's just some very, very powerful high-cost permanents that are in the monocolored variety that if you can tutor it out with Emergent Ultimatum and make your choice of your opponent have to choose between, for most or less, a rock and a hard place between these, then it's just going to be absurd. Like, you can just see every high-cost permanent that is like in blue and red and such, and just be like, hey opponent, which ones am I going to play for free? In Standard, I think people will try this card, but I do think there is a little bit of a weakness to it, and that's the factor that Teferi's in the format. With Teferi in the format, you obviously don't want to cast this spell, because if you try to cast it for free, Teferi negates it because of Teferi's static effect, so you gotta keep that in mind. But I do think it has a slight teeny little chance in some fire-based lists, because that effect, being able to get some very effective permanents out of your library onto the battlefield, still, and then the opponent still has to choose between a rock and a hard place of which of one of the free monocolored planeswalkers you have in your deck they want you to have. Especially answering to planeswalkers would be ridiculously hard. So it has a slim chance, even though the mana cost is ridiculously high, but it's blue-green, and blue-green ramp is absurd currently at the moment, so yeah, I think it has a slim chance of seeing play in Standard, if I'm being honest. There's the actually regular art of Narset, which is still really good, especially since it's kicking, kind of like popping out of the art. Really nice. Probably my personal favorite companion of the bunch, Kahira the Orphan Guard. 1 in hybrid mana of Selesnya for 2, essentially. Its companion, each creature card in your starting deck, so it's just only creature cards. You can still have other cards in your deck. Each creature card in your starting deck is a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast card. So if you meet those requirements, then it's a companion. And it has vigilance, and it has each other creature you control that's a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast gets +1/+1, and has Vigilance. I like this card a lot. I kind of like it because there's a lot of cool creature types that are coming from Ikoria. Like, we do have some really cool dinosaurs. We have pretty much all these relative creature types here. And the fact that if someone just wants to make a mid-range value creature-oriented deck design, they could actually just play this as their companion and such, and then just get a really good Lord-based effect. Plus, it also has the Vigilance, which there is some creatures in this set that actually give you a benefit with Vigilance. The catch-22 is you probably can't put it in the main deck if you want this as your companion, but if you decide to put this in the main city, then you are going to actually have some fun with this. I don't think this will see, like, competitive play, because while that Lord effect is nice, it's not, like, amazing. Like, it still is going to make some things prone to board wipes unless you, like, buff, like, say, a Questing Beast. Let's be frank, Questing Beast is already buffed enough, but still, I do like this card. I do think it has a slight little bit of potential to see some standard play. At least, the very least, it will see a lot of brawl play, because this is both adorable and cute at the same time. Let's just cut to the chase. This is just adorable art. Okay, next up, it's a translation, so they call it Frillneck Fashionista. Scryfall's joke name, essentially. 2 and a red for a human warrior. When this enters the battlefield, put a menace counter on a target non-human creature control, which for menace, it can't be blocked except by 2 or more creatures, and then it has an activated ability of 2 and a red, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with menace. I like this uncommon a lot. I do like this cycle because it seems like this cycle is kind of like encouraging, kind of like you playing on turn 2, like your bears being like non-creatures, or non-human creatures specifically, because then you could actually turn free, play this, make your 2-drop into a menacey creature. There are some really good 2-drops that giving a menace is kind of silly. Like, imagine, say, for example, a Dreadhorde Butcher, for example. The one that's hasty whenever it deals damage. Put a counter on it. So pretty much you turn 2 do that, turn 3 do this, give it menace, make it really hard to block, especially, and then still it increments up better and better and better. So I'm thinking stuff like that. There's also just the fact that it has a decent activated ability. If it doesn't see play as standard, it's definitely going to see a lot of play unlimited, because that ability is pretty strong. Especially if you can go into a Menace tribal deck, which there are incentives that do that, mind you. Like, every keyword matters deck is kind of having their tribal-based synergies and such. So overall, good limited card. I think you'll see some fringe standard play in the right aggro decks. Next, speaking of incentives to play Menace, Sonorous Howlbonder, 1 and 2 hybrid of the Rakdos variety, for a human warrior 2/2 Menace. Oh, and each creature you control with Menace can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. Ooh, this one is one saucy card. Like I said, the factor is there is a lot of Menace-based creatures. We've even seen some Menace-based creatures earlier in the kind of like spoiler seasons and such. And the factor that this can be played on turn 3 to make those menacey creatures very, very harder to block, which then gives you more incremental damage, very nice. Now, the catch-22 is this Semi-Lord is a 2/2, so it is prone to a lot of removal that's coming to the format and is already in the format, mind you. But there is definitely still some incentive to do this. Like, we even have, like, Angrath from War of the Spark that gives all of our creatures menace, and having this also as well can probably lead to some pretty silly shenanigans, especially if you do, like, a token-based strategy and such. So, I like Sonorous Hellbonder a lot. It has a teeny little bit chance of seeing some frame standard play in the right aggro decks, but mostly it's just going to be a really good limited card, in my opinion. Next up, one of the most bonker cards they spoiled today, in my personal opinion. Son of Creation. 1 green, blue, and a red for an enchantment. You might play an additional land on each of your turns. Whenever you cast a spell, draw 2 cards. At the beginning of your end step, you discard your hand, which is a cost. And I'm saying cost in quotation marks because I'm going to explain myself. Wow, this card is really, really nutty. So, let me explain why this card is nutty. 1. This card is nutty because the factor is, this is very powerful effects that we usually like to play on creatures. Like, we have creatures like Triad of Elysian Grove that we like the first effect on, so the factor that this is on enchantment, which could be a lot more trickier to remove, presuming your opponent's not running enchantment removal, Which, granted, there is a lot more incentive probably to run it now, especially with some of these enchantments being in play in all of the wedges and such. So you got to keep that in mind. But still, all those effects are relatively powerful. Playing additional land, really good. You also factor that when you cast a spell, you draw 2 cards. That's nuts. And the factor that discarding in your hand is a cost, but in the right deck, that could actually be an advantage, especially if you're playing like any reanimator based strategies, or using jumpstart cards, or just have cards that you can have incentives to return cards. Like we have stuff like Tamiyo in the format, Collector of Tales essentially. And Tamiyo, if we have a permanent in the graveyard we want to bring, we just play our Tamiyo -3. Boop, there we go. We bring it back. And also the other thing that's really absurd about this card, it's a non-legendary enchantment. Which means Mirror Maid is a card, so you can do some ridiculous shenanigans like play Son of Creation, then play Mirror Maid to copy Son of Creation, which then stacks the effect, so it means you can play 2 additional lands each turn, and then each time you cast a spell, you're going to draw 4 cards and such. I definitely think, and we have incentives to do massively draw of our deck and hopefully make our deck smaller, especially when we have cards like Vasa's Oracle in the format. I think this card, unless the enchantment hate is significant in the format, I can see this card seeing play. At the very least, it's going to be a Commander All-Star because, I mean, all those abilities are relevant in Commander. Playing additional lands, drawing cards, and as long as your Commander deck design can take a benefit of your cards being wheeled, so to speak, or discarded. There's even just synergy of cards that we have in the format, like the Buccaneer, that whenever you discard a card, you ping your opponent, or even a card we're going to talk about later, which helps us gain our discarded cards back, so to speak, but it's a nutty card. Like, it's probably one of the most nuttiest cards I've seen today, if I'm being honest. Going to see standard play without a sweat. I think someone is going to try to crack it, and when they do, it is going to be quite obnoxious. Though I will say, I am tempted to get the foil of this because the Noah Bradley art on this is gorgeous. Just gorgeous. Nevertheless, I can go on more, but let's actually talk about the other ultimatum they revealed today, which is the Absent variation, which is Eerie Ultimatum. So absent of the ultimatum price, sorcery. Return any number of permanent cards with different names from your graveyard to the battlefield. Ooh, boy, that is a saucy spell. Now, I think this is more going to be a really great Commander card, mostly because I think Commander is where this is going to see its most advantage play. Mostly in these colors, they do have graveyard matter-based synergies, and the fact that this card, essentially, if you go into a heavy mill plan, mill kind of like have your graveyard as your library scenario, the factor that you can cast a spell and return all relevant permanents you want to bring back with different names, and since they have different names, they will have different names because you're playing Commander. Return all the stuff that's been in your graveyard to the battlefield. That could be a finisher in some circumstances. That could be just I win the game in Commander. Like, that's what the spell says to me in Commander. It's like, in the right decks, it pretty much says, I win the game. In Standard, maybe. This is a legit maybe for me, because the problem is, with this card, you want to kind of go into that mill-based strategy, but that strategy also likes to play escape cards a lot, so you really have to skip on the escape mechanic, because then you exile your cards, which then makes Eerie Ultimatum kind of less effective. Still, there is also the possibility that, yet again, I'm going to have to bring this up with Fires of Invention. You could just, if you see a lot of stuff in your graveyard that's already got removed because you've been stalling the game long, you could just Bay of Wishes again, bring this out. Oh, hey, I'm going to bring back all my relevant permanents and get a significant enough board state that hopefully helps you win the game. Yeah, these ultimatums with Fires of Invention is quite scary when you think about it. Oh boy. Nevertheless, great card, great Commander card, and, well, as long as Fires of Invention is still a card, it still will see standard play, and if a Graveyard Matters deck that uses this as their finisher, I mean, you could splash blue and still play Teferi and then cast this at the end of your opponent's turn with a lot of creature cards in your grave. Oh, that would be gross. But again, you can't do the Fires of Invention with that, so, This one's an interesting one. Next up, translation again. So we got the Scryfall Silly translation, which is Punk Minter. Okay, I had to admit, that was a clever joke name. Anyway, Punk Minter. 2 and a black for a human cleric. When Punk Minter enters the battlefield, put a lifelink counter on target non-human creature you control. 1 and a black, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with lifelink. Pretty decent card, I'm going to say. Just the factor is, it's a nice free drop. A 1 free for free is not bad, especially when it gives one of your creatures lifelink. You're definitely going to have a lot of non-human creatures in this format with the mutate mechanic and all that stuff. So being able to put this like on a significant, like big, like a 4/4 or maybe even a 5/5 and give it lifelink and such, and then it swings in with the lifelink, very significant. Plus, also the activated ability is nice, being able to make your lifelink creatures bigger. It's definitely going to be a good limited card. In standard, I mean, there is the cute shenanigans you could do this, like Orzhov Lightgate is a deck, so you can play turn 1, your Healer's Hawk, turn 2, a Johnny's Pridemate, and turn 3 this, make your Johnny's Pridemate into a lifelinker, and then swing in, and then make it incrementally bigger each time. It has a chance. I'm going to say it. In the Orzhov Lightgate deck, it's going to have a chance. Next up, one of the more weirder companions we've seen, Jugentha the Wellspring. 4 and 1 of Gruul hybrid mana for a legendary creature elemental elk. It has companion. No card in your starting deck has more than one of the same mana symbol in its mana cost. Okay, to explain this, what it's essentially saying that no card in your starting deck has more than one of the same mana symbol in its mana cost. So essentially what it's saying here is that you can't run spells that are, say, 2 black mana or 2 white mana is how I'm reading this. So you can only run spells that have like 1 green mana symbol in the mana pool or 1 blue or 1 white is how I'm reading this card. I think, honestly, this is one where I'm going to have to play it to actually understand this a little bit more because the wording on that is both understandable but also a little weird. So, in other words, you can also play this in, if I recall correct, you can still play cards in the deck that has like a white and a black mana symbol, just make sure it's not 2 red, 2 blue. That's how I'm reading this card. Nevertheless, what do you get if you play this as your companion? Well, you have an activated ability of add Wooburg. This mana can't be spent to pay generic mana costs. The first thought that comes to me is Niv Mizzet Reborn could actually play this card. The Fires of Invention variation of the list could actually play this card pretty well. Because they still have stuff like Rhythm of the Wild, which they use to essentially give haste. And the factor is they have a lot of... The problem is they can't really play any of the more powerful spells that usually are in the guild colors that are 2 white, 2 black and such. But if you can accommodate your deck design to make it where it just only has powerful cards that are of specific, like, 1 mana, 2 mana symbols, essentially, and such. I mean, this is one of those cards where I think, like, all those free color wedge cards, if you want to make, like, a legendary tribal of that variation, then maybe Jugentha the Wellspring can actually have some pretty good potential. Like, it's a weird card. It's definitely going to be one of those I'm going to have a challenge brewing around this, especially if I do the companion challenge. But that ability is really, really strong. Don't underestimate that ability. Being able to tap this for 5 mana, especially if you have any way to give this haste, which there are ways to give this creature haste in this format and also in previous standard, this could just be a free spell, essentially, because you could just spend, like, achieve 1 cost permanent that's white and such, and just, like, there is just a bunch of really silly shenanigans you can do with this card. I don't exactly know how I'm going to brew around it. Like, that's going to be a fun brewing challenge once I see the whole set and just figure out how I want to brew it. But it's definitely going to be a fun challenge. I'm going to say that. It's definitely one of the more weirder kind of companion brew rounds. But it's definitely going to be an interesting challenge. I do like the card a lot, to be honest. Next up, this is the promo art of it, but there's actually a full story on this. Forbidden Friendship. 1 and a red sorcery. Create a 1/1 red dinosaur creature token with haste and a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. If you're Boros tokens, you might give this a shot, I would say, because the 1/1 haste is actually pretty nice. This is also another thing to keep in mind if you are running kind of like a non-human based synergy deck. The cutest thing you can do with this is on turn 3, play this spell, and then if you have 1 blue mana open, play that 1 spell we were talking about that costs 1 mana to draw 2 cards. That's actually a really, really cute synergy with this card. I think it has actually a good chance to see some play because just 2 cheap 1/1s, one of them being haste, is just, we're fine with that. Like, we usually will play 1/1s that when they die, they give us a 1/1 token. So, a 2 mana, get 2 1/1 tokens that have potential synergies in a format that is going to matter about with human and also non human based synergies. Definitely a card to keep an eye out. I'm not kidding you. This is actually a potentially standard playable card. Now, one card that's potentially standard playable to one that's okay, let's be frank. This is a standard playable card. No sweateroni to the pepperoni on that one. Sea Dasher Octopus. 1 blue, which, okay, 3 mana, 2/2 with flash. But the mutate cost is 1 and a blue, and it has flash, so you gotta keep that in mind. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. This card is really, really, really good. Because here's the thing. The factor that this has flash speed kind of gives it kind of like a ninjutsu feel. It kind of feels like a Curious Obsession. Because all you have to do is, like, on turn 1, play, say, a Spectral Sailor, or any card that you know you can swing in for damage on turn 2 and such without much problem unless the opponent removes it. You do that swing in. Before you deal damage, you can flash mutate this onto it, make it a 2/2, not only deal an extra point of damage, but also draw a card out of it. That's really good. Plus, also, just the factor is you can also do other, if we have a lot of other mutate matter synergies in this meta and such that are coming up. A lot of powerful, like, Apexes that have powerful mutates, and this is one of the cheapest mutates that we have. So the factor that you can do this at flash speed, like, let's say on any of the Apexes, if you go into a multicolored deck strategy, ridiculously absurd. Like, you can do those effects at the end of the opponent's turn. That's really nutty. This will see play. It's a really good card. I like the promo art of this, but I also like the original art personally, but both arts are really good. But still, really good card. It's a 5-star card. Like, it will see play. There's a deck that's going to take advantage of this. Next up, Keep Safe. 1 in a blue for a counter target spell that targets a permanent you control, and then you draw a card. Combo decks will probably take advantage of this, or creature mid-range decks that are in blue will probably take advantage of this to help protect their stuff. It's not a bad counter spell, especially since we are going to be in a meta where removal is going to be aplenty. But it's not, like, amazing. It's, like, mostly potentially sideboard, with the only exception of main board play is probably in combo decks, or decks that want to keep, like, their turn 1, turn 2, or turn 3 permanent safe and such. The factor that this can also help counter stuff like the factor that this is, well, no, it doesn't counter Ancient Treachery since it doesn't target until it ETBs, so no, that doesn't work. But the factor that it can counter, like, the ultimatums that target or casualties of war is actually pretty nice. So, yeah, it has a chance. But also unlimited, it's a good 23rd card. Next up, a card that I think every content creator is looking at and being like, can I do a janky brew with this card? Zenith Flare. 2 Boros colors for an instant. It deals X damage to any target, and you gain X life. Where X is the number of cards with cycling ability in your graveyard. This card's really, really good. First of all, this is actually in the Cycle Matters Jeskai Commander deck, which we'll talk about the Commander decks in a later video and such, but it makes perfect sense in that deck, and I do feel like if a standard Cycle deck is going to exist, it's because this card is a really absurd payoff for Cycle Matter-based deck designs, because at worst, this can be just a decent mid-range removal spell to, like, a mid-range creature, which then when you cycle more and more and more, can either in late game become a potential finisher in some really good decks. Plus, we have spells that can help us get our cards quicker into the graveyard, so I can see, like, kind of like semi-dredge standard decks that have been going around and such that self-mill themselves for Foss's Oracle. If they can't get away with the Foss's Oracle and they have Jeskai in the colors, they could actually just use this with enough cycling cards in their deck. It's just a decent finisher, because There are some times where if you put enough like cycle cards in your deck, this could deal like a decent 10 points of damage, which a 10-point life swing, which is a 20-point life swing, is nothing to sneeze at. So I think this card has a chance. We definitely need to see all the cards in the set to see if a Cycle Mana deck can work in Standard, but if it can, this card is a really good removal and payoff spell. Next up, Sanctuary Smasher for red for a 6-mana 6/4 with first strike, but you can also cycle it for 2 in a red, which honestly you're probably going to do a majority of the time. That has, whenever you cycle this creature, put a first strike counter on target creature control. I like this card a lot. Mostly I like it because it's a good combat trick. Most of these cycle matter spells will put a counter-based matter counter ability on your creature. I think it's going to see a lot of play actually in Standard because the factor is it looks like a semi-combat trick. You play, you attack with your creature, and then your opponent decides to block. They don't think you got anything. You cycle this, you draw a card, and then you just get the first strike ability, which then helps protect your creatures and such. Definitely going to be a limited mechanic that I would say that's going to be taken advantage of to its fullest, but it's also, I think, going to be a really good standard mechanic as well. I mean, for example, imagine cycling putting first strike on, say, your questing base. Enough said. But yeah, I do think this cycle is actually going to see a lot of play potentially, especially with the right counter mechanics and such. Like, I'm really curious to see what the blue one is out of this cycle. But overall, good card. If you have to play it for 6, you can still play it for 6 because a 6-mana 6/4 with first strike is not bad. But honestly, you're doing this majority for cycling, if I'm being honest. Next up, Bushmeat. Bushmeat Poacher. 3 and a black for a human soldier. It has an activate ability of 1, tap, sacrifice another creature. You gain life equal to the creature's toughness, draw a card. Great limited card. There's some potential that you could probably play this in Rakdos Sack and such, which maybe. I think there are better sacrifice outlets and such, and I don't think they're going to play this. I mean, honestly, yeah, especially since you have constant life gain synergies with stuff like the Cauldron Familiar shenanigans and such. But unlimited, perfectly fine card. Next up, Keensight Mentor. 2 and a white for a creature human cleric, 1/4. When it's just the battlefield, put a vigilance counter on target non-human creature control. And it has an activate ability of 1 and a white to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with vigilance. The fact that a Johnny from War of the Spark is still a card kind of makes this card kind of amusing to play, because the factor is you play this card maybe early game, then you play a Johnny out, and then you can just activate her ability to put a +1/+1 counter on all your creatures. Pretty cute, especially since all the creatures will have vigilance thanks to a Johnny and such. But I think it's more going to be a decent limited card than standard card. Unless if the Vigilance Matters tribal deck exists. Because if it didn't exist, then this card is actually pretty decent in that deck. But we're going to have to wait and see. Overall, though, fine limited card. Not great, but fine. Next up, speaking of a payoff for Vigilance Matter deck designs, Alert Heed Bonder. 1 in hybrid of Selesnya for a human scout, Vigilance 2/4. At the beginning of your end step, you gain 1 life for each creature you control with Vigilance. Well, if you want to pay off for the Vigilance deck, here you go. It's actually pretty decent. A 3-mana 2/4 body is perfectly fine, especially with that end of turn effect, just being able to gain life for each creature you control with Vigilance. If you can do like a token-based deck with that Johnny from War of the Spark, being able to earn like between 2 to 3 to maybe even higher points of life gain, especially if you found a way to incorporate Heliod within your deck design, it can get nutty pretty quick. So if there is a card that can make the Vigilance Matter deck work, it's going to be probably this card. Because it's going to be definitely a good counter against a lot of burn-based deck synergies that are in the meta. Next up, Garrison Cat. A 1-mana 1/1. When it dies, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. Mostly you're going to play this in either aristocrat-based strategies or token-based strategies. It's perfectly fine card in standard. It's not been like the right home about. Like 1-mana 1/1s, unless you are doing Cat Tribal, Next up, Spontaneous Fight. 2 and a white for an instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until in a turn. Then you put a flying counter on it. Perfectly fine card. Just it's a decent combat trick, but also it could be used as a potential finisher. You probably don't want to sleep on this, especially if you can make a really, really big creature have flying. It's a form of evasion, so keep in mind on this is the semi-combat trick can also be used as a semi-finisher if you put it on one of your like late game bombs that doesn't have good evasion. So keep in mind of this card. I do think it has a lot of good limited play potential. Standard, probably not. Next up, Majestic Auricorn. I love the art on this. Anyway, it's 4 and a white for a creature unicorn with mutate, 3 and a white. And then it has a 4/4 with vigilance that whenever this creature mutates, you gain 4 life. Overall, pretty decent limited card. I would say, especially with the life gain matters, the fact that every time you mutate on this card, you're going to gain 4 life, which is a significant point of life, mind you. So yeah, I like this card potentially for limited. Standard, it has a chance. It has Vigilance, so it could go into that Vigilance Matter deck design, especially if it has a Mutate subclause, like Mutate sub-mechanic and such. So, it has a chance. Plus, you could probably put this either on one of your bigger creatures and such, like, oh boy, it's going to be weird when you mutate like a god like Hilliard or such. It's going to be, this Mutate mechanic, I'm anticipating it because I think it's going to be fun to mess with, but I also realize it's also going to be a bit of a challenge with some specific board states. Let me just put it like that. Speaking of more unicorns, we got the Splendor Mail, 2 and a white for an elk unicorn. Okay. It is lifelink, and it's also the cycling 1 and a white. When you cycle Splendor Mare, put a lifelink counter on target creature control. Same thing applies, as I said, with all this cycle. Could be used as semi-good, decent combat tricks. Now, lifelink is not really a great combat trick, especially since it's not going to get a toughness boost or such. But in the right decks, you're probably going to still like this. Like, imagine giving your Questing Beast lifelink, or imagine putting like this on a really big trample creature and such. It has a chance. Especially, it definitely has a chance in the sideboard, though, especially if you are going against like an aggro-based matchup and you need like incremental life gain on one of your creatures that you have mid-game and such. So, it has a definitely good chance. Next up, pretty much they call this Checkpoint Officer. That's the official translation. 1 and a white for a creature human soldier. 1 and a white, tap target creature. Honestly, perfectly fine limited card. Probably not see much play in standard since we still have stuff like Giant Killer, which is a much better card than this, personally. But, who knows. Maybe for a budget option. Next up, our Nightmare Squirrel. Finally, we get to see it. It's Halisa Glider, 2 and a white for a Nightmare Squirrel. It enters the battlefield with your choice of a flying counter or a first strike counter on it. It's decent. It's a decent limited card. It also has some decent constructed, in quotation marks, for budget applications, because the versatility of both either giving it flying or first strike is very nice. It's a fine card. I was kind of hoping a little bit more. I was hoping like a legendary Nightmare Squirrel or something, but this is perfectly fine. Not amazing, but fine. Next up, translation they have is Reptilian Mirroring, 2 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever you cycle a card, this enchantment becomes a 5/4 dinosaur creature with trample and haste in addition to its other types until end of turn. If you're playing Cyclomatic deck, you might want to give this a shot, especially if you know you're going to consistently cycle in limited, because the fact that this is a free mana, potentially consistent 5/4 with trample that could be harder to target on an opponent's turn, not bad actually. Like, this is a really decent limited bomb, I would say, if you're in the Cycling Matters deck. If you're not, don't play this, because if you don't have any cycling, this is literally a free mana do-nothing enchantment. Does it have a chance in standard? Maybe, because, yeah, especially if that cycling deck exists, then it has a chance. But, probably not. Probably not. I could be wrong, though. One card that will absolutely see play, because it's one of the more absurd removal spells in black, with one of the more saddest arts I've seen in a while. Heartless Act. 1 and a black for an instant spell. Choose 1. Destroy target creature with no counters on it, or remove up to 3 counters from target creature. This card is really, really good. The factor that it is the closest thing we got to Doomblade in a while in Standard. And Doomblade is a really good card. So the factor that this can, as long as your creatures don't have any counters on them, can actually destroy a creature just like that, anything from early game to a late game bomb, pretty significant. Like, the only awkward thing is this is really hard to destroy Hydra Crasises, which that's probably going to be awkward, but you still have to remove counter claws, which is alright, and maybe if you're playing late game with Hydra Graces, you have stuff like board wipes to deal with it, like Ritual Suit and such. But also, this is actually a really decent counter to Nissa man lands, essentially, because all you have to do is remove the free counters from one of the Nissa lands. Boom, it's dead. And it's also the same reason, the fact that this card is so good is the reason why I think you want to keep an eye on that whole cycle of cards that give a counter on your creature when you cycle it, because that can be used as a semi kind of like hexproofy trick to help protect your creature when a Heartless Act trigger goes on it. Like, let's say you have a creature that doesn't have an ability counter on it, your opponent tries to Heartless Act it, you have the mana up, then you can just cycle it, give it a mana ability, and then it basically negates the spell. Still, presuming if that strategy doesn't go into play, this is just going to be a really nutty card. It's really good. It's going to see standard play, and it's also a perfect bomb in limited. Though the factor that a lot of ability counters are going to be rotating around, it might not be perfect all the time, but for a majority of the time, it's just pretty much unconditional removal. Next up, their translation is the Supercharger, 3 and a red for a creature dinosaur. Whenever it attacks, if it doesn't have first strike, put a first strike counter on it. And whenever it does attack, if it has first strike, it gains double strike until end of turn, and it's a free. 4 mana for a hill giant that can sometimes get first strike as long as you attack with it once, and then every turn it can then pretty much attack as a dotes at double strike. Pretty decent limited card, I would say. Standard, probably not, unless you're playing like Dinosaur Matter synergies and such, which even then there are better dinosaurs. Next up, Flock of Resistance, 1 hybrid of Azorius for creature human wizard. It has flying, and in creatures you control flying have spells your opponent casts target this creature costs 2 more to cast. Like, if you're playing Azorius Flyers, you're probably going to play this card. It's actually a pretty decent card. It's a flyer itself. It helps protect your flyers, as long as it's not board wipe at the very least. So, yeah, I think you'll see some play. Especially in Azorius Flyers. But probably only in Azorius Flyers. Next up, Weaponize the Monsters. 1 red for an enchantment that has an activated ability of 2. Sacrifice a creature, weaponize. This enchantment deals 2 damage to any target. Really good card. I mean, Rakdos Sack probably will want this card a lot. There's also the potential that this could see play in Jund Sack. Pretty much any sacrifice-based deck that plays stuff like Mayhem Devil and such will probably want to give this card a shot, because just the fact that it's 1 mana is significantly cheap. Yes, you do have to spend 2 mana to activate this effect, but theoretically, you should have enough mana if you want to activate this effect, especially if you have like a Mayhem Devil on the battlefield. Then it becomes like deal free damage to any target. Or the more Mayhem Devils you have on here, it then increases more and more. So, yeah, this card has a pretty good chance of seeing in play, if I'm saying. If in the specific sack decks. Now, on the other side of the coin, this could also be very awkward to play it, and maybe in the sack decks, and maybe they won't want to try it, especially since they have the Cauldron Familiar, which is Oven synergy. But I do think it has a really good chance, because the sacrifice decks are going to like this card. At least the ones specifically in Brawl are going to like this a lot. And in Commander, yes, there's Goblin Bombardment, but hey, redundancy is never any bad thing to happen, especially with removal in the format, so yeah, it has a pretty good chance to see him play. Next up, the Screep Free? 1 in the green for a creature beast. Whenever a creature controlled mutates, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature and you gain 2 life. Perfectly fine limited card. Maybe some standard application, since in some instances it's kind of like a Wild Growth Explorer. But on the other hand, it doesn't, unless you mutate this specific creature itself, it doesn't put the counters on itself, so still prone to removal. So, I think it's more of a decent limited card than a standard card, but we'll see. Next up, a card that's going to see a lot of standard play, specifically in the Fetter decks. Fight as 1. 1 white instant, choose 1 of both. Target human creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains indestructible until end of turn. Or target non-human creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains indestructible until end of turn. Ridiculously good protection spell in pretty much Fetter decks. The fact that you can attack your District Legion Guard and your Fetter with this spell is ridiculously absurd. It also has a chance to see a play in pretty much any deck that's running white that has pretty much both creatures of both types of human and non-human variety. It's just a really good instant. Just the factor of getting indestructible. As long as your opponent is not doing like a negative X spell, it's pretty much going to protect the majority of your things. So, overall, pretty good card. Helps protect against board wipes. It's going to see play. Especially if any decks like will want this effect, which the Fetter decks are going to love this card. Next up, the Ozolith. Probably one of the silliest cards that I've seen. It's a 1-mana legendary artifact. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it has counters on it, so any specific counters, put those counters on the Ozolith. And then at the beginning of combat of your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all counters from the Ozolith onto a target creature. So, you mostly want to put this in kind of like a counter-based Matter Synergy deck. Like, you want to put this like maybe with cards like Hydra Krasis in the format, or maybe even a Mass. The fact then that this card can work as a semi-way to protect your investments of your mana, like you lose a creature that has a lot of counters on it, you put those counters on that, and then you just then, beginning of combat, put it on another creature, maybe one that you can attack in with. Very cool card in that sense. There's also some silly synergies. I'm not going to go into full detail of it because I got to try to get this video to be as short as I can. There's definitely some silly planeswalker creature shenanigans you can do with this, but that's like a whole nother video in itself on how you do that. But pretty silly card. It has a chance of seeing play, especially if counter-based decks are possible. It's definitely a card I want to brew around during the early access event because I do think it's going to be a fun card to brew around at the very least. Next up, Hornbash Mentor. 2 in the green for a human warrior. When it enters the battlefield, put a trample counter on target non-human creature you control. And then it has 2 in a green. Put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with trample. Really good card. Just the factor is that the fact that it puts a trample counter on maybe one of your powerful 2 or 1 drops, especially if those drops can get incrementally bigger, that can be pretty silly pretty quick. And the fact that it has that activated ability can just make your trample creatures bigger, which trample with this effect is a lot more, how would I say it, a lot more potentially better in the long run because, hey, they have trample. When they attack in, there's still damage that's going to go through. And that can just be used as a finisher, especially since we have some trample matter synergy cards within the set. I think it has a chance to see standard play. A slim chance, but a chance, nevertheless. And in Limited, yes, you play this in Limited. Next up, the Parcel Beast. A card that I am still surprised they printed, if I'm being honest. 2 green and a blue for a 2/4 that is an activated ability of 1. Look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield. Not tapped, you put it on the battlefield. And if you don't put the card into the battlefield, put it into your hand. Which then you're like, oh, 4 mana for this effect, that's not that bad. Until you see the fact that it has a mutate cost of green and blue. Why? No, seriously, why? Is this card good? Yes, it's really good. It has the potential to see some standard play very heavily because the thing is, ramp is really good in this format. Like, we have stuff like Arbial Grazer, Gilded Goose, that you can consistently get this out by turn 2 and still have a mana up to activate the ability. Presuming that if the creature can activate the ability, which it usually can, especially if you cast it on turn 1. So the factor that then you can get incremental ramp or card draw is just silly. There could be a chance that maybe it's too much ramp and maybe they'll cut this out for other stuff, like they keep their arrows in and all that stuff, but I do think this has a relatively good chance because that's just a really decent activated ability. Incremental card draw, never underestimate it. Incremental ramp, never underestimate it. We have stuff like Risen Reef that shows us that. And the fact that this is ramp that helps the lands enter the battlefield untap is nothing to underestimate. Oh boy, there's a very good chance it's going to see standard play, and it's going to make the people who still are being salty about blue-green probably more saltier, if I'm being quite frankly honest. Okay, and I think... Okay, we already talked about Fiend Artisan, I know. So, let's see. I'm going to go just real quick back to cards that I know we talked about, and then just essentially then go from there, so... I know we ended right about... Not here. Right about here. So once we get back to here, I know then we've done this. So, okay, so going back, I have to just keep myself in check with this. So we still have a couple cards to go, but let's go for the ones that we haven't talked about yet. Reality Everwise. Remember how I was talking about with that Teamer enchantment, there are incentives to discard in your hand? Well, here you go. 1 blue and a red for 0 free. Gets +1/+0 for each instant sorcery card in your graveyard. So it can get big pretty quick. Oh, and whenever you discard 1 or more cards for the first time each turn, you draw that many cards. So, discarding that hand was a downside? Well, hey, thanks to this card, you draw a new hand. Oh, and by the way, if you're constantly discarding cards into your graveyard, you're probably going to be discarding a lot of instant sorcery spells, which then makes this bigger. Oh, and by the way, since we have stuff that gives like counter matter based synergies, give stuff like First Strike or Trample and such, then you can actually make this have Trample, and then it could get ridiculously big, ridiculously quick. Good thing you can't mutate this, because if you could mutate this, oh boy, this card would have been absurd. Nevertheless, great card. I do think it has a really good chance. It has a good chance to see play in the Draw 2 archetype. If a Teamer-based deck that wants to play that enchantment that's really absurd wants to see play, then they are going to play this card probably without a sweat. Really good legendary, and I do think people are just going to love playing this legendary in like a discard draw-based deck synergy, or maybe even just put it in the cycle deck a little bit. So, I like this card a lot. It's a good card. We did talk about the Quartzwood Crasher. I don't think we talked about Chevelle. We may have, but I'll just talk about it again. So, Chevelle, Bane of Monsters, green and black for a 1 free Death Touch at the beginning. Oh yeah, I did talk about this. Overall, quick opinion of the card. It potentially is good, but we're going to have to wait and see. Though granted, seeing that we have that like 2-cost removal spell, this card might actually be a lot better. Well, no, that doesn't work because then you put the... No, never mind. That doesn't work because you put a bounty counter on it and you can't target creatures with counters on them. So, actually, no, that doesn't work. Actually, yeah, this card might have actually got a little bit worse because of that aspect now, coming to think of it. Huh. The factor of how cards get better or worse when you see more cards in the set, huh? We already talked about General Kudrow. We talked about the monkey. We didn't talk about this yet. Migratory Greathorn. 3 and a green for mutate 2 and a green. For whenever this creature mutates, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and shuffle your library. Perfectly fine ramp card. It's definitely going to be good limited. Also good if you're doing color fixing of any sort. Does it have a chance for standard play? Maybe, but usually by this time you're playing Uros and such, so unless you're playing a heavy mutate deck, probably not. But still, maybe. We already talked the Mythos. We already talked about the Extinction event. We already talked about Mythos of Netfall. We already talked about the Chittering Harpster. We already talked about the Calvin Whisperer. We talked about that. We talked about that. We talked about that. There we go. Now new cards. Let's talk about Tentative Connection. 3 and a red. The spell costs 3 less to cast if you control a creature with menace. And then you gain control of target creature until in a turn. Untap that creature. It gains haste until in a turn. Oh boy, this is nutty. If Rakdos Sack can get a menace-based sub-strategy, this is going to be ridiculously absurd. Going to be a decent limited card, especially if you're in the red-black menace deck. But yeah, I think this is mostly has a really good chance in standard, because as long as you have a creature with menace, this is a 1-mana take anything, which is kind of silly. Especially if you have a sacrifice outlet. Blitz at the Thunderwaptor. 1 and a red for an instant. It deals damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to the number of instant sorcery cards in your graveyard. If that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, it's out instead. It has a chance. Especially if you're in kind of like those dredge decks or decks that are going to put a lot of cards into that graveyard that are instant sorcery variety. This can be an incremental burn spell, so it's something to keep an eye on. Especially since it exiles, that's very significant, especially since we have cards like with Escape and such in the format. Patagia Tiger. 4 and a white for a 3/4 flying. When it enters the battlefield, target human you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn. It's a perfectly fine limited card. I don't think it's going to see much standard play, though I think some people might try to play this with Luca and such just for thematics alone, with Vorphis flavor. But honestly, it's just a good limited card. Not really that great in constructed, if I'm being honest. Next up, Loris of the Dream Den. 1 hybrid of Orzhov colors. For a legendary creature, Cat Nightmare Companion, each permanent card in your starting deck has converted mana cost 2 or less. It's a free 2 with lifelink. but it has during each of your turns, you may cast one permanent spell with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard. This card is nutty. This card is really, really, really good. I mean, the factor is a majority of this deck within this color pie has kind of like sacrificial-based outlets, and the fact that this can recursively bring back your early game, like, significant creatures like the Outset, as I mentioned before, or even just, like, let's say it brings back your Aristocrat Matter cards, like your, like, oh, I'm forgetting the name of it. Cruel Celebrant, like bringing back Cruel Celebrant or stuff like that. And there's even just silly shenanigans. You can go very silly with the deck design here and such. Like, pretty much having this companion requirement is not that costly, especially when you consider the fact that it's only restricted to permanents. So you can still have higher cost instant sorcery cards within your deck design, which there is a lot of them even in the set itself that does synergize with this card pretty significantly. So, yeah, it's a good card. There is a reason why, at least last time I seen it, it was like $15 for pre-order, because it's a good card and it will probably see a lot of definitely experimental play. Whether or not it's going to be a standard viable card, we're going to have to wait and see, but it's definitely going to be a fun card to bring around. Next up, Cub Warden, free and a white for a free 5 lifelink, but you can also mutate it for 2 and 2 white. Whenever this creature mutates, create 2 1/1 white creature tokens with lifelink. Perfectly fine card. I think it will have a chance to see standard play, especially if you have token-based matters or cat-based matter synergies. It's definitely going to be a fun card to play around, but it does, especially also since those creature tokens have lifelink, so it could also go in the lifelink deck, so it's something to keep in mind. Next up, it's a Rulant Wolf Bear. This is funny. Free and a green for 4/4. When it attacks, you may change the base power and toughness of target human you control to exuberance, power, and toughness until end of turn. Perfectly fine limited card. I don't think it's going to see that much standard play, but I do think some people might try it out because, come on, it's a wolf bear. And if there's enough human-based tokens, then especially if you can get like specific humans that have additional abilities that affect and get the toughness and power boost, it's something to consider. Next up, Sanctuary Walkdown, 2 and a white. Humans you control get +1/+1, and it has an ability of 2, tap 2, untap human creatures you control, tap target creature an opponent controls. It has a chance. I say it has a pretty good chance of if you're making a humans tribal deck, it has a chance to at least going into that deck as a one-of, like in a brawl deck. But it also has a slight chance. Like, semi-lords that are on enchantments are always stuff you kind of have to keep an eye out. They sometimes see play, they sometimes don't see play. This one has the benefit that it has the activated ability that, mostly with human decks, you have the kind of con of trying to swing in and such. So the factor is, if you can find some way to, say, give your creature tokens vigilance and such, which there are ways in the format to do that, you could just essentially begin combat step before, and then just attack with a lot of things, and then before blocks are declared, tap humans down to help essentially make it where your opponent can't block. It has a chance. Especially since we have means to reduce that cost, kind of like that little Fox that we were talking about earlier and such. So, yeah, there's a chance. Insatiable Hemorrhage, we already talked about it. Flourishing Fox, we already talked about it. Fallon Felidar, I don't think we talked about this, so let's talk about this. 2 green and a white for a free 5 vigilance. Creatures you control with vigilance have 1 tap target creature. So if you're playing a Vigilance Matters deck, you're probably going to play this card at least as a 1 or 2 of, because that ability is actually pretty nice. Especially since like maybe you have like tokens that you gave vigilance thanks to a Johnny and such, and you have bigger significant late game threats that you want to attack in without being blocked by a Death Touch creature and such. The fact of that, then you could just use one of your tokens to tap and then essentially tap it down, so you could swing in with this free 5, or like with the other creatures that are significantly bigger. Yeah, it has a chance. It's definitely going to be a fun prove me around card. We already talked about Forbidden Friendship, Capture Spear. Honestly, just perfectly fine limited card that is also just good budget removal if you need it in standard. Cathartic Reunion, pretty good card. It's definitely going to see play in kind of like the Is It Phoenix decks and such, or even Dredge-based Matter deck designs. It's a good card. It will see some play. Migration Path, I think we already talked about it. Lord Dracus, this one we didn't talk about. This one also has a mutate hybrid of blue or red, but it costs 1 blue and a red. Whenever this mutates, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. I don't think you want to sleep on this card. I do actually think this card is a lot more decent than people are actually giving it first glance. The factor is, there are some times where you are going to want to get some like instant sorcery spell on a fly, especially if you need to, like, say, for example, need to remove a significant threat, but your removal spell is in the graveyard. The factor that if you have a creature on the battlefield, you can mutate this, activate the ability, and then hopefully like remove a problematic target, or even bring, like, maybe if you're in kind of like that teamer deck as I was talking about before, the factor that in that teamer deck, then what you can do is if you're discarding your hand constantly and you are needing to get a instant spell to help with interaction work for your victory condition and such, the fact that you can mutate this, return that back. So yeah, I think Lord Dracus is actually a lot more better than people are giving it credit for. I do think it has a chance. Next up, Cunning Neckbonner. Blue, Dimir hybrid mana essentially for flash. Spells with flash you cast cost 1 less to cast and can't be countered. It's a good card. It's really good. It will see some standard play, but I think it's more of a good card as a sideboard card in the flash decks. Maybe main board in like mono blue flash. But I think people who are saying like this is going to make Simic Flash absurd or like is it Flash are very underestimating the fact that 2 blue on turn 2 is a little bit tricky in those multicolor decks. You could probably get this by turn 3, and let's be frank, a majority of people on turn 3 want to hold up a counter spell than actually play this. But granted, it does have flash, so you could just hold up the counter spell and then play this when you know you can, so maybe. Maybe. But the factor is that activated ability making it cost 1 less, and the fact that it can't be countered, ridiculously absurd. It will see some standard play, especially if Flash can actually finally see play. Next up, Saval Thundermane. Red and white, so Boros colors, for an elemental cat. Whenever you cycle a card, you may pay 2. When you do, this will deal 2 damage to target creature, and you gain 2 life. Perfectly fine if you're going into a Psychomatis deck. I think it's more going to be a good limited, but there is some potential of this in standard, especially if the cycle deck can exist. This is actually a pretty decent card in that deck because Cycle can be instant speed, so you can just use this as a semi-combat trick to also just remove a very problematic 2-drop, or maybe a problematic Planeswalker that just minus, so it's something to keep in mind. Next up, Escape Protocol, one of the nuttier enchantments I've seen. Whenever you cycle monocolored enchantments, let me phrase that. We have seen a lot of nutty multicolored enchantments, but this is the most nutty monocolored one. Whenever you cycle a card, you may pay 1. When you do, exile target artifact or creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Oh boy, this is... Like I said, I can't really go into full detail since I'm kind of on the fast run, but I'm just going to say this card's pretty good. There's a lot of powerful artifacts that being able to cycle it, you can do some very ridiculous shenanigans as long as you have consistent cards to cycle and such. I mean, like, imagine this in Historic with stuff like Gilded Lotus and such. Like, you can tap the Gilded Lotus, do a cycle, and then you pay the 1 mana for the cycle ability, since there are some cycle cards that cost 1 mana. You then essentially bounce your Gilded Lotus, bring it back to the battlefield. It's a flicker effect, so it doesn't do it until in a turn. You get the Gilded Lotus back, then you tap it. I mean, like in Historic, imagine this with stuff like having like 3 to 2 Power Stones out, and you kind of see where this card can get a little bit nutty. Plus, also, if you have like ETB powerful effects like Agent of Treachery and such, well, yeah, no brainer why that's silly. Though granted, a majority of those decks are usually run Fatsa and such for the more consistent aspect of it, but if you play a cycle-based deck that does this, then yeah, you're probably going to play this for that. Really good card. Has a really good chance to see standard play. Next up, go for Blood. 1 and a red for a sorcery target creature you control fights target creature you don't control, and it has cycling for 1 mana. Honestly, it's a perfectly fine limited removal spell if you need it. The cycling ability on it's nice. Slim chance for standard play since there's a lot of more efficient red removal. Red don't usually like the prey upon effects. They usually like the pretty much burn spells. I mean, if you're playing big red and you're playing big creatures, maybe, but I highly doubt it. Next up, Thwart the Enemy. 2 and a green for an instant, prevent all damage that would be dealt this turn by creatures your opponents control. Yes, free mana for a fog is expensive, but remember, this is a one-sided fog, so I could see this being used as a semi-combat trick in some decks. Like, let's say, for example, You're attacking with a significantly big creature, your opponent tries to block with Death Touch, then you can just activate this ability, kill the Death Toucher without much sweat. Or even stuff that there can be some times where people will trick you this in limited, and this can just be a late game, kind of like sweeper kind of scenario. So, I think it's a lot more decent than people are giving it credit for, but I can understand why it's not, like, amazing. It's like a, don't, like, the fact that it's one-sided is what makes this really good. If it wasn't one-sided, then I would say this was really bad. But since it's one-sided, it's something to keep an eye on. And then Swallow Whole, or as people like to call it, Path to the Snack Isle. 1 white for sorcery. As an additional cost to cast a spell, tap an untapped creature you control. And then if you do, you exile target tapped creature. You put a +1/+1 counter on the creature tapped to pay the spell's additional cost. On one hand, it is a very situational spell. Like, the fact is, you have to have a creature that is tapped. You have to have a creature yourself that you can tap to do this effect. And the fact that it's at sorcery speed is a little bit tricky. However, it's still unconditional 1-cost removal. So if your opponent tries to attack in with a non-vigilance creature, and they attack in like with, say, kind of like a dragon or something, like a 4/4, let's just go with a random example of that. The fact that you can answer like a 5 to 4 cost dragon with just a 1 mana removal spell, as long as you make sure you keep a token, which in white you probably can easily do. Yeah, I do think this has a chance. Plus, if you have also counter-based synergies, obviously you're going to try this card. So, I do think this card has a slim chance, but it is really tricky to play. So, you got to keep it in mind. But there is also Teferi in the format, and Teferi does make this instant speed, so yeah. Then we have Lava Brink Venturer, 2 and a white for a free. When it enters the battlefield, choose odd or even. Lava Brink has protection from each converted mana cost of the chosen value. It's a fun card. I don't think it's a great card. True, the factor that you can essentially give it protection from a specific board presence, depending on how the board presence is there, is kind of cute. But the thing of the matter is, remember, it's also protected against your stuff. So you have to be careful. Like, you can't say protection from even and then be like, oh, I'm going to attack in and then attach my Ember Cleave, because you can't, because it costs its cost, which is even and such. So I do think this is a card where it's kind of a brew around kind of scenario. And even then, I think there's a lot of consistent removal in both even and odd costs, and also threats that are in even and odd costs, that I think this card is probably either A, going to only see sideboard play if people can know they can get away with the odd and even clause thing, or B, probably to see some really janky Bray and some human-based tribal decks. Next up, Bastion of Remembrance. 2 and a black for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 right human social creature token. And then whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Ooh, this is really good. A free cost aristocratic enchantment is nothing to underestimate. Like, we usually love these on creatures, even though we know the creatures are prone to removal. And yes, technically enchantments are prone to removal, but they are usually not stuff that people main board enchantment hate kind of scenario. You don't really see that usually. So the factor is, you can put this like starting in your aristocrat deck, and then you can sideboard it out when you know your opponent's going to be running enchantment removal. It's probably going to be a nifty little trick that people can do. Plus, you get a token out of it, which is nice. So, yeah, I do think this has a pretty good chance. Free cost is a lot, but that effect, plus also keep in mind, Mirror Maid is still a card. So, if you want to play like a Esper aristocrat deck, just use Mirror Maid, copy this, then make your sack triggers, get incremental more life gain and loss to your opponent. Yeah, this has a chance. Thieving Otter, 2 and a blue for a Otter, and then when Thieving Otter deals combat damage to an opponent, draw a card. Perfectly fine limited card. It's probably not going to see much standard play, but I think some people will play it as beginner budget because, 1, that art is adorable, and 2, it's kind of a hilarious card. Next up, Rooting Mullick. 4 and a red for a creature lizard. When it enters the battlefield, exile target card with cycling ability from your graveyard until the end of your next turn. You may play that card. It also has cycling too. Maybe? This one is interesting because On one hand, that effect can be pretty powerful. On the other hand, 5 mana to do that effect is pretty costly because you both have to spend the 5 mana to cast a creature, and then when you do that, then you have to until the end. Well, wait, it's until the end of your next turn. Actually, I read that. I thought it was until the end of your turn. If it's next turn, maybe that's a lot more better. Yeah, that's actually a lot more better because then, like, if you have Xenon Flare in your graveyard, you can just, and you have a lot of cycle cards in the graveyard already, you can just ETB this, return Zenith's Flare, and then at the next turn, just be able to cast Zenith Flare. Okay, it has a chance. Plus, there's also the possibility that if a Fires of Invention cycle deck can work, this would actually be pretty silly in Fires of Invention lists, potentially. Plus, you can also cycle it and such, so it has a chance. It does have a little bit of a chance, but it also could be just really too high cost. Then there's Ominous Sea, 1 in the blue. Whenever you draw a card, put a Foreshadow counter on Ominous Sea. And if you remove 8 counters on it, create an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token, and add Cycling 2. Don't underestimate this card. This card is actually legit pretty cool. Especially since we've seen stuff like the Teamer, kind of like enchantments we were talking about before. The fact that this can combo with the Teamer enchantment is kind of absurd because you draw a lot of cards. When you draw those lot of cards, you put Foreshadow counters on it, and seeing that it doesn't sack itself when you put the Foreshadow counters on it, when you remove it and such, you can use this as kind of like a consistent way to make a consistent 8/8 blue Kraken creature token, which in 8/8s are pretty big threats that people will try to remove, and if they can't, then that can be used as a finisher. So, yeah, I do think this card does actually have a pretty decent chance of seeing some competitive play. Maybe in the draw 2 archetype, also possibly in the Teamer base deck that's going to draw a lot of cards. So, yeah, 2 mana for a do-nothing enchantment when it enters the battlefield is kind of meh. But on the other hand, if you already have one out and you have this stuck in your hand, then all you can do is just cycle it to help fuel the one on the battlefield. So, yeah, I like this card a lot the more I think about it. We already talked about the Great Horn. Okay, this is one of the scariest enchantments I've seen. Footfall Crater. 1 red for an enchantment aura. Enchant land. Enchant land has target creature gains trample and haste until end of turn. Oh, and it cycles for 1. Ridiculously nutty. Don't underestimate cards that can give you lands pretty powerful effects like this. The fact that then you don't have to worry about casting creature or enchantments that do, well, like, Rhythm of the Wild and such. Yeah, Rhythm of the Wild is probably a better-ish card, but the factor is land hate is a lot less consistent than enchantment hate, and the fact that you can use this to essentially either just give a creature haste on the turn it's cast and such, nothing to underestimate, especially when you can do it on stuff like, say, like a Galta in Historic or stuff. So, don't underestimate these cards. This actually does have a slim chance. Oh, and also in Mono Red, giving Torben haste or giving one of your late game bounce threats in Big Red is nothing to sneeze at. So, yeah, I think this card's really good. I think it has a chance. It's up Boneyard Lurker, 2 Gagari, or 2 hybrid mana of Gagari for its mutate cost. Whenever this creature mutates, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. Perfectly fine card. Has pretty much a good chance for some constructed play, especially if a mutate deck is consistent enough. Being able to return a permanent card is nothing to underestimate, especially if you're in the deck that puts cards in their graveyard consistently, which Gagari can consistently do that. So yeah, I do think this card is a good card, and it might have some chance for standard play, or at the very least some commander or brawl play. Next up, Pouncing Shushark. 4 and a white for a mutate 3 and a blue. For flash, whenever this creature mutates, you may return target creature an opponent controls to your owner's hand. It's pretty much Dawn Raven, and you never want to underestimate pretty much cards can help you bounce stuff. That's really good limited. In constructed, maybe. And then I think I'm going to do these ones really quick. Stormwild Captor, 1 free, Bird Goat, flying. If non-common damage would be dealt to it, put that many +1/+1 counters on it instead. It's a fine flyer creature. It's kind of nice that it can protect against like damage-based board wipes, which is kind of cool. So it makes damage-based removal spells a little tricky to use on it. But on the other hand, maybe. Like, I think it's a decent sideboard card if you know you're going against mono red or some shtick like that. Mythos of Brokos. It's pretty much the 4-cost sorcery, and if you use blue and black to spin it, then you search your library for a card, put that card into your graveyard, and shuffle your library. Then when you do, you return up to 2 permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. Actually, a pretty good card. I do think this actually has a slim chance, because while it is a 4-cost tutor, in a sense, if you do spend the whole Sultai color to do it, the factor is the Sultai ability on this is actually really nice, being able to tutor for a specific card to put in your graveyard that you're going to return back with the second part of the card. It's actually very nice. There is stuff like Tamiyo in the format that might make this card kind of irrelevant, but I do think it's a card not to sneeze on. And in Commander, obviously in the right decks, they're going to love this card. Shark Typhoon. Silliest card ever. 6-cost enchantment. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create an X blue shark creature token with flying, where X is the spell's converted mana cost, and then you can cycle it for X 1 and a blue. Whenever you cycle Shark Typhoon, create an X blue shark creature token with flying. I think it might be a little bit too slow, but if someone can actually go off with this deck, I will laugh my head off, because a bunch of shark tokens would be hilarious to see. But I don't know. I think it's more going to be a commander card than a standard card. But maybe in Fires of Vengeance, maybe. We're going to talk about Riel. I think the last card of the night is Olbush the Prey Piercer. Free hybrid of Rakdos for its companion cost. If you want to cast as your companion, you have to have your starting deck contain only cards with odd converted mana cost. So like 1, 2, essentially stuff like that. And land cards. And the reason why they say land cards specifically is because technically land cards are considered even since they have 0 mana cost, so to speak. So anyway, what happens when you cast this? Well, if it's on the battlefield, if a sorcery control with an odd converted mana cost would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. I feel like if an odd aggro deck can exist, they might try this card out, because there's some silly shenanigans you can do with this card, because this is the one where the companion cost, the payoff you get for it is very relevant to the companion cost. You play only odd, only aggro cards, you play that, and then you be able to double your damage. Like, imagine this with, say, like odd burn spells, or like odd aggro-based creatures and such. And there's even some really cute shenanigans you can do with this card, where you can have stuff like Bone Crusher Giant technically still within your deck, and since it's an odd cast creature dog, you still have that even removal spell, but it doesn't break the cost on the Olbush the Prey Piercer. So then now you have a 4/3 that then will deal double damage. That's pretty silly, dealing 8 damage and such. I mean, if an odd aggro deck can exist, I think they are going to love this card. But it's going to be a wait-and-see kind of scenario. We gotta have to wait and see the whole set. If there's a lot of aggro-based creatures in Standard that can be of the odd variety. And then after that, I think that's all the cards. Whew. Okay, this video took a lot longer than I thought. I'll probably edit it in the morning and such. Nevertheless, thank you all for watching this. If you give me the time to watch this, I appreciate that. If you can like and subscribe to the video, that would be lovely. And if you have any suggestions about these cards or any additional inputs that I've missed, I would appreciate hearing them in the comments. Nevertheless, now I gotta get to bed. I hope you all have a lovely day. This is LevDev, signing out. Bye-doo.